Hello, everyone. Welcome to our eighth week in the apologetics series, the eighth lesson, really, where we're going to talk about the problem of evil, which is also the problem of pain or the problem of suffering. I'm going to approach this lecture or this class just like any other, where I will go through a review real quick of what we did last time, an agenda, and then we'll get right into the conversation or the things that we need to know for the problem of evil. If you have questions, I encourage you to write them down so that the next time we meet, you can ask those to me. If you want to or have anything that you want to discuss, please take notes, write it down. Other than that, I want to move through this pretty quickly so that I'm not taking up too much of your time. So, just as a review for miracles that we just did, there are we talked about different approaches to defending miracles, mainly the evidential approach and also the philosophical approach, and how those are different, and really how the philosophical approach needs to come first before we provide evidence. We talked about David Hume's argument and his influence on the conversation about miracles. And within that, we looked at his argument and really three major parts of his argument. We looked at the uniformity of experience, we looked at beliefs on evidence, and then we looked at miracles as a violation of natural law based on how Hume understood uniformity of experience and his beliefs on evidence. And then we also looked at C.S. Lewis's response to David Hume. Mainly, what we wanted to see from C.S. Lewis was his kind of undermining of naturalism and his argument from reason. Lewis believed that if he was able to really question naturalism as a worldview and show that something came from outside the natural order, which human reason he believed did, then he could really create some problems for Hume's argument. We also looked at some of the things that Lewis said about probability and uniformity in Hume's argument and how they both acted circularly within Hume's argument. So tonight, we start a new section where we're going to talk about the problem of evil. It's also called the problem of pain or the problem of suffering. And the first thing that we're going to do is we're actually going to look at the philosophical argument, the argument that people will make when they argue for the problem of evil. And we're also going to look at two different types of problem of evil. One is the emotional problem of evil, and the second is the philosophical problem. And this is so that we know how to approach this problem depending on how a person is reacting to evil that they see in the world. Are they acting emotionally? Are they acting philosophically? And that will let us know how we need to respond to the problem. Although, really, we're mostly going to talk about the philosophical problem in this class tonight. We're going to look at the deductive problem failure, is what I'm calling it. Some people have tried to use the problem of evil as a deductive argument, and we're going to talk about how that fails to really make its case. We're going to look at unsatisfactory answers to the problem of evil, primarily looking at atheism, looking at the answer of a finite God, God as not omnibenevolent or all good, the non-existence of evil. So some people just flat out deny evil exists. And then we'll also talk briefly about karma and reincarnation. And excuse me, a lot of this information that I'm going to go over tonight was in the reading that was assigned for this class, the Douglas Groothuis um, chapter that we went over. And so if some of this stuff will be review from the reading. So if you did the reading, great, this will make sense. If you did not, then you've got a little leg up to when you go in and actually do the reading. You'll understand a little bit better what's being talked about. We're also going to look at the origin and nature of evil, and then we have to actually face the problem. So after we've done all this stuff, talked about, the deductive problem, talk about the two different types, talk about unsatisfactory answers, talk about the origin and nature of evil, we actually have to then look at the actual problem of evil once we've cut away all this other stuff from it that just doesn't give us a satisfactory answer. And in doing that, we're going to look at different answers that are offered to this problem. Mainly, what we're going to look at is the free will defense in a couple different ways that is offered up. We're going to look at the greater good defense. And then we're also going to look at, I've labeled it here, the cross and the resurrection of Christ, but I'm going to look at John Frame's tri-perspectival answer on how he tries to answer the problem of evil. And so those are some answers that are offered. Not all Christians agree on them. Not all Christians use them. Not all Christians um, like every one of those answers. I'm just trying to give you kind of a few different options of where you can go to find find an answer to the problem of evil. So with that, we need to first state the problem of evil. And I've did this as one slide because I want this all to come out right away. But the problem of evil or pain or suffering presents the most significant obstacle to the Christian faith. And I'm not trying to be hyperbolic when I say that. This is something that most apologists agree with, that the problem of evil really brings the most significant challenge to the Christian faith. But the way that the problem is stated, it's if we can state it in five different points here. If God were all powerful, then he would be able to prevent evil. If God were all good, then he would desire to prevent evil. If God were all powerful and all good, there would be no evil. There is evil, therefore, there is no all powerful, all good God. And this is how the argument is actually set up in John Frame's book, Apologetics. But this is basically how the problem of evil is set up. If there were a God that were all powerful and all good, he would both be able to prevent evil and he would desire to prevent evil. If God were all powerful and all good, there would be no evil. So what people will say is either he doesn't desire or he is not powerful enough, or there is no God because there is obviously evil in the world. And so that's really how we set up this argument to start out with. This is what we're going to be working with. Now, there are two ways to approach, or two types of the problem that we see out there in the world today. There are two ways that humans experience a problem of evil. They experience it both emotionally and philosophically. The emotional problem of evil is when a person experiences emotional suffering from an evil act or any kind of evil action, something that's happened to them, anything like that. So we could use the example of a person losing a loved one. Death is not something that's pleasant. We generally tend to think that it's evil. It is not natural, even though a lot of our culture wants to say that death is, just the natural way of things. Christians believe that it is not natural. And so we see it as part of evil. It is part of sin and how sin was brought into the world, and as sin brings death into the world. And so people experience the emotional problem of evil when a person dies. And I know this is not news to any of you. And I'm sure that many of you have probably experienced this before. And this is especially, this especially happens when a younger person dies or a child or something like that. That's something terrible and awful. This is the emotional problem of evil. What we want to be careful to do as Christians and as apologists is not to go and try to fix the emotional problem of evil with a philosophical answer. If you have someone who is experiencing the emotional problem of evil, it is much better, much smarter, much more beneficial to the person you are trying to help to get a pastor, get a counselor to talk to this person, to listen to this person. They don't want to hear your philosophical answers of why God has allowed evil to exist in this world. That's not going to help them. So this is something right away that we need to be mindful of as Christians when we go into these types of conversations. Is a person dealing with the emotional problem of evil? If they are, we shift gears not into apologetics, but into something else, counseling or soul care or something like that. Something that this class really doesn't cover, but we do have other people who can teach those things within the church. The philosophical problem of evil is attempting to philosophically and theologically understand the apparent existence of both God and evil. So that is the philosophical problem. Many people want to paint this dilemma that God and evil cannot exist both simultaneously, that one has to exist or the other, but they both can't exist at the same time. And so for the Christian, philosophically, and theologically, what we are attempting to do is to show there is good reasons to believe that both God does exist and he has allowed or permitted evil to exist, to coexist within this world for a time. And so that is the philosophical problem of evil. But when we put these two problems up there, it's very easy to see that you can't answer the emotional problem with a philosophical answer, and you can't answer the philosophical problem with an emotional answer. They're not meant to do that. There are two different things. So we want to keep this in mind. We want to keep these two problems in mind when we are approaching, especially non-believers, in our conversations about the problem of evil. Is there an emotional assumption or trigger lying behind the philosophical question? Anything like that? Because if there is, we may need to deal with that emotional problem before we can ever get to the philosophical problem. Now, moving on, um, again, both types require differing approaches. And so we are mainly dealing with the philosophical problem tonight in our class. Now we're going to talk about the deductive problem failure. And what I mean by this is there have been many attempts by atheistic philosophers over the centuries, especially over the last 300 years, where they have tried to formulate the problem of evil as a deductive argument. Now, if we go back a few weeks where we talked about our theistic arguments, I talked a little bit about the difference between deductive and inductive arguments. And deductive arguments are where the premises necessitate the conclusion. All right. So, one of I think the argument we used mainly in that class when we went over that is that all men are mortal. Socrates is a man, therefore Socrates is mortal. The two premises that we use for that argument, all men are mortal and Socrates is a man, they necessitate the conclusion that Socrates is a mortal. And so some people have attempted to set up the problem of evil as a deductive argument like that, where the premises necessitate the conclusion. And that's opposed to inductive arguments where the premises make it more probable that the conclusion is true rather than false. And so that's the big difference between inductive and deductive. The deductive problem of evil has it's a failure. You can't argue that way, and I'm going to show you why. The deductive problem goes more like this: if God exists, he would not permit evil to exist. Evil exists, therefore God does not exist. Now, this is a deductive argument. This is where if you take these two premises, these first two premises, if God exists, he would not permit evil to exist. Evil does exist, therefore God does not exist. That's a deductive argument, and it's not a bad argument, except for the fact that to overcome the problem, all the theist or the Christian must do is demonstrate a scenario where God and evil could coexist. So it completely obliterates the argument right away. You can't set up the problem of evil as a deductive argument. It just doesn't work. You would have to be able to claim universal knowledge. And so all the Christian has to do in order to get around this kind of deductive argument is that we have to show, well, there could be a scenario where God would permit evil to exist. And that's exactly what we're going to do when we look at some of our solutions and answers to the problem. We permit scenarios where God would allow evil to exist for a time along with his existence. And so if you ever have anybody who is arguing for the problem of evil, and they're using a very deductive formula. If they're forming the problem deductively, you can very easily get around that by saying, well, I understand your argument here. According to how you're arguing, all I would need to show is a scenario where God and evil could coexist, and I would defeat your argument. So that's one thing. Most atheists don't use this deductive argument anymore. It's really gone out of fashion because it's so easy to overcome, because all you have to do is demonstrate a scenario where both can exist. And so this, I call this the deductive problem failure. Most people don't use it, but it is out there, especially with people who aren't trained in philosophy. They may try to use an argument like that. So just be aware of that. Okay, but because the deductive form of the problem fails, it will be more prominent than that the problem is built inductively. Okay, yes. So because the deductive form of the problem fails, it'll be more prominent that the problem is built inductively. And what this means is, if God exists, he would not morally permit evil to exist. Evil does exist, therefore, there is good reason to believe God does not exist. So there's a big difference in both our premises and our conclusions. If God exists, he would not morally permit evil to exist. So we've changed that first premises a little bit. We're talking about evil as, or we're talking about God not morally allowing evil to exist, rather than evil and God coexisting just being something that cannot happen. We're making more of a claim there where we'd say morally God will not excuse me, we're making more of a moral claim about God where he will not allow evil to exist. And then we say evil does exist, therefore there is good reason to believe God does not exist. The premises of this argument do not necessitate the conclusion. The premises give us a more probable argument to believe the conclusion. So really, when we're dealing with the problem of evil, we're trying to overcome an inductive problem like this. So the premises do not necessitate the conclusion. This is a much more difficult argument to overcome. Some arguments focus on probability, others focus on skepticism. Some will focus on it's more probable that God doesn't exist. Some will focus on the morality. Some will focus that we can't know that God exists. So there's all different ways to approach that. So be ready for it, but understand that we're not approaching this from a deductive pattern. We're approaching it from an inductive form. So some of the unsatisfactory answers that we see for the problem of evil, there are numerous answers to the problem of evil that cannot be embraced by the Christian. We see all kinds of answers out there in culture and different religions today that we just simply, as Christians, because of what the Bible teaches, what we doctrinally believe, we cannot accept these answers. And these are answers that are in Groothuis's book, in his chapter. So these should be very familiar to you. But atheism as an answer that God does not exist, therefore evil just exists, that is not an answer the Christian can accept. The Christian cannot get around the problem of evil by stating there is no God. That is the atheistic answer. We cannot say that there's a finite God or a limited God. The Bible does not teach God is finite in any measure. Therefore, a Christian cannot embrace this solution. We cannot embrace a solution that gives evil so much power that God is limited in his provision and his sovereignty and everything that he does because of the power of evil. We do not worship a God like that. We worship a God who is infinite in his character and attributes. And if you want to learn more about that, take one of our systematic theology classes that we offer. We cannot embrace the answer that God is not omnibenevolent. Omnibenevolent is the fancy theological, philosophical way of saying all good. The Bible teaches that God is all good, even though we may not understand how he is all good. So I think that this is a huge problem for people in America today, even many Christians in America today, is that we tend to think of God being good only when he gives us exactly what we want. He's a magic sky fairy or some kind of form of eternal Santa Claus or something like that. And that's simply not what the Bible teaches. The Bible teaches that God is all good, irrespective of what happens to us here on earth. That and we don't always know his reasons and understands why he does what he does, but we understand that his purposes are his and they are good. And so this is just we cannot accept this idea that God is not all good, therefore he allows evil to persist. Some more unsatisfactory answers: the non-existence of evil. I don't think anyone can take this option seriously. It's apparent that evil, both of human origin and natural origin, or what we would call natural evil, exists in the world today. I mean, it's there. I don't know how anybody can um, sanely deny that. I think if someone really tried to deny evil existed, they would have to, I mean, they would have to have a few screws loose upstairs. And so it's just that's not something we can embrace. We have it in the Bible. We know it's there. We experience it day to day, both in our lives and in the lives of the people around us, and what we hear about the world and what and things going on today. I mean, we're watching right now an really a world power attack another sovereign nation, and we can't just stand by and say that's not evil. That's, there's nothing evil going on there. So this is not an appropriate answer that is offered by some people. Excuse me. And then karma and reincarnation. So this goes into some of the Eastern religions, Hindu and Buddhism, but they teach that the scales of justice are balanced not in this lifetime, but over a series of lifetimes. Now, I am in no means am a master or an expert in Eastern religions. I know very, very little about Hinduism and Buddhism, but I know enough to talk a little bit about what karma and reincarnation teach. And they are things that the Christian just simply cannot endorse because they are so axiomatically different than what the Bible teaches. They advocate these systems that do not believe in a personal soul. And so most forms of Buddhism and most forms of Hinduism, from what I understand, they advocate these systems of karma and reincarnation that do not believe in a personal soul. And what that means is that everything that presents the illusion of a soul is broken up at death. And the problem with that, if our soul is only an illusion and that's all taken apart at death, there really is no way of getting at the personal self. There's no way of defining you as a person, who you are. That's all illusory. There's nothing else to it. And so no personal being is then reincarnated. So if a person did a lot of bad things in this life, but his his illusion of the soul was completely broken up at death, and then he is reincarnated into a completely different person, he's not actually reincarnated as a person or a self. He's something completely different. And what that means is there's no actual justice. They try to teach that the scales of justice are balanced over a series of lifetimes, many, many lifetimes. But if a person who does great evil never receives, the punishment that he deserves, then there's really no justice. And that is exactly what happens in this type of system, because everything about the illusion of the soul, everything about the person and the self is broken up at death and reincarnated in a completely different, unknowable way. And so I don't find that I don't think this is personally a satisfactory answer. And I know that doctrinally Christians cannot and should not embrace it. And so those were the answers that we cannot embrace. Going to move on now to the origin and nature of evil. And this is important for Christians to understand because there are so many different philosophies and religions out there that paint evil differently than how Christians ought to understand evil. It's very important that we understand evil in biblical terms. Otherwise, we cannot offer a proper response to evil and the problem of evil. And so, a biblical worldview, so I apologize, I'm not sure why this all came up at once. I thought I had it set up differently. A biblical worldview must understand evil through the parameters of creation, the fall, and redemption. In creation, we see two major truths. We see that God created out of his own wisdom and declared it good. God was not obligated to create anything, it's that he wanted to create. He created out of his own wisdom. And because he is a omnibenevolent God, because he is all good, he declares his creation to be good. The second major truth is that we see God created man in God's image and likeness, and that it was very good. So, what we get from these two major truths is that creation is objectively valuable to God because God did it out of his own wisdom. He did it out of his own preference, his own wanting to do it, not because he had any obligation, but because he wanted to create in a certain sense. And so, in doing that and calling it good, we see that creation is objectively valuable to God. We also see that the universe is not deficient because it is separated from God. Many religions and even people who consider themselves spiritual today. And you hear this all the time. Everyone's like, I'm not religious, I'm spiritual, or you know, much of the new age movement and even some Christians act like this today, but they think that the material universe, what God has created, is deficient because it is separated from God. It's not part of God's spirit. It's not spiritual enough. And that is simply not what we see in the biblical teaching. We do not see a deficiency in creation because it is not part of God. God calls it good, and in the sense of man, he calls it very good. So there is no deficiency simply because it's not part of God. We also see that the universe has structure and it has purpose. So we can't say that this universe is just a combination of time plus matter plus chance, which is what we talked about with naturalism. There is purpose behind it. There is something that has structured it, namely God. We also see that we see human moral responsibility on how to live because of this. Because God created everything good and in his likeness and in his image, he also imprints in giving us his image and likeness, he imprints that moral responsibility on us on how to live. And so those are some major truths we see here in creation. We have to understand evil by bringing these truths to the forefront. We cannot understand a biblical view of evil without having these truths stated first. Now, with the fall, it's best to understand the fall when looking at the problem of evil as human defection from original intentions of God. First, in creation, we talked about God created man. He created man very good. It was not God's intention to create man bad or evil. It was God's intention to create man good. And when we understand the fall, then, and how this comes in and how evil comes into the world, we understand it as human defection or human rebellion against God and his intentions for creation. Evil is not intrinsic to man or the natural world. What it is, evil is not a product or a byproduct of God. Evil is a result of man's rebellion against God. So man was not created evil. We go back to our first point as evil not being intrinsic to man or the natural world. Man and the world were not created evil. There was no part of design or purpose of God to create us with any evil within us. He did not put that there. And that evil entering into the world is not a product or even a byproduct of God's creation. Evil is a result of man's rebellion against God and nothing else. And what we'll come to understand is that evil was not really a thing in and of itself. It's not something that's out there that just exists. It's a counterfeit. It is something that can only exist by overturning what is good, perverting what is good. And so this is why things or creation meant for human enjoyment are not intrinsically evil. And I'm sure you've heard maybe in a sermon before, or maybe in other teachings within the church. Oh, a lot of I grew up in a denomination where sometimes people would say things like, we don't drink, we don't chew, and we don't go with girls who do, saying that things like alcohol or tobacco or any sexual relations were intrinsically bad. And no doubt that people could fall into some major sin if they treated those things like vices. But things of creation where God has created us as creative beings to make alcohol or to purpose tobacco to where we could enjoy it, they're meant for enjoyment and not necessarily, they're not intrinsically evil. Another big one is sex. I grew up in the 90s where everyone kissed dating goodbye, and all these relationships were just thought of as evil, 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 and you can't ever touch one anybody or anything like that. And yes, that is true. You should not awaken, sexual passion before its time within marriage, but at the same time, it's not evil in of itself. What's evil is awakening it before its time, using it out of the context in which it's meant to be enjoyed. And that's why, that's how we should understand evil. It's not a thing of itself. So I wrote down there alcohol, sex, food, etc. Food is another big, food is one that we don't talk enough about Christians as Christians. Gluttony as a sin is something that I know that I've probably been guilty of myself. I think it's not hard to look around American culture and find people who are guilty of it. It's not one that we talk about in the church very much, but we abuse food a lot of times, and it was meant for nourishment. It was meant for goodness, and sometimes we repurpose it for emotional comfort, or we repurpose it for just fuel for the body rather than something to be enjoyed. So there's a lot of things that are going on there, and you could extrapolate this principle on and on and on throughout all different aspects of creation. But the main thing we want to understand here, evil is not intrinsic to man or the natural world. God did not create evil. It's not a product of his. It's not a byproduct of anything he does. Evil is a result of man's rebellion against God's good intentions and his designs, his purposes. This is why we understand that things within creation that are meant for human enjoyment, they are not intrinsically evil. Food, sex, alcohol, all those things are not evil in and of themselves. They are made evil by man's rebellion against God's good purposes. So that's the fall and how we understand evil. And then redemption. God's creation is broken, but not ruined beyond repair. Again, Grotius talks about all these, so this should be review for you. But that is something that is central to what we talk about in the gospel. God's creation, yes, is broken through sin, but it is not ruined beyond repair. There is redemption that is possible. God promised redemption through the seed of the woman. We see that right after the fall in Genesis 3, 15 through 16, kind of the proto evangelion, what they call that sometimes, the first gospel promise of redemption. God continually revealed himself through creation, culminating in the incarnation of himself in the man Jesus Christ. So have we have redemption. Redemption is possible there, and God makes the redemption of evil and the redemption of rebellion possible. And so we have to understand the origin and nature of evil in this kind of context through creation, through the fall, through redemption. If we don't have all of these aspects apparent to us when we're talking about evil, we are going to get this problem wrong. We are going to give false answers because we're not giving a biblical response, especially where I think especially when we talk about the fall and we talk about evil not being intrinsic to God's creation, I think a lot of Christians, especially American Christians over the last 100 years, have really, really struggled and, really turning a lot of God's creation into evil things that just aren't evil. They're not meant to be evil. Now, when they are abused and not used for God's purposes and how he has given them as gifts to his people, yes, they can that can cause us to sin. And, we rebel against God when we don't follow his purposes. But we cannot understand evil and give a proper uh, answer to it without understanding this origin and nature of it. Now, moving on, facing the problem, given everything that we've talked about so far on this problem of evil, we talked about the different kinds of evil. We talked about the deductive problem and how it fails and how it's set up as an inductive problem. Talked about the nature and origin of evil. We talked about unsatisfactory answers to the problem of evil. With all of that in mind, now we can actually face the problem and really kind of form it so that we understand it better and how to respond to it as Christians. So, how do Christians bring together the facts that God is all powerful, all knowing, all good, and that evil exists? So, excuse me, we understand that God is omnipotent and omniscient. We understand that God is omnibenevolent. So those are fancy words that we use in theology often. God is omnipotent. That means that he is all powerful. God as omniscient means that he is all knowing. And then God as omnibenevolent means that he is all good. So we hold these truths. And we obviously, as Christians, we believe that. We believe the scriptures teach these three truths. But we also believe that there is objective evil. We believe that there is evil out there that exists. We cannot deny that. And so the question becomes, how do we hold all of these truths in contention with each other? And so for any evil that God allows, God has a morally sufficient reason for allowing this evil, even if we do not know what this morally sufficient reason is in some cases. And this is how we answer it. So we have to hold those first 3 points in contention. God is omnipotent and omniscient. God is omnibenevolent. We believe that. We believe the Bible teaches that. But we also believe, because the Bible teaches it as well, that there is objective evil in the world. We can't deny any of that. So how do we do that? How do we proceed in holding all those truths together in one hand? But we really have to say, for any evil that God allows to exist, God has a morally sufficient reason for allowing that evil to exist, even if we do not understand those reasons in our time and place right now. And so that's where we're going in answering the question. That's where the answers to the question are going to revolve around, understanding that God has a morally sufficient reason for allowing this evil to exist. Excuse me. And so that's where we're going to go into some of the answers that are offered for this problem. And so one of the first answers that we want to go into is called the free will defense. Now, there are two versions of this free will defense, and they are called compatibilism and incompatibilism. Now, you may not see everybody use this type of language, but in philosophy and in certain parts of theology, compatibilism and incompatibilism have to do with the relationship of God's sovereignty towards the human will. And when we talk about free will, when we talk about a person's ability to choose, compatibilists, or the people who espouse compatibilism, will say that God is supremely sovereign, but he also gives us a free will, and those work together. That was, in fact, the case of men like Augustine. John Calvin believed that. So even to an extent, Martin Luther believed that, although I don't think he explained himself very well. But they do believe that God gives the person a free will to a certain extent, and that God's total sovereignty is not violated by that will. Whereas incompatibilism, when we're talking about free will, says that those two ideas of God's sovereignty and and man's free will are completely incompatible. They do not relate to each other. Therefore, God cannot violate a person's free will. And I'll explain what that means. But there are two versions of the free will defense, one that is offered by compatibilists or compatibilism. So we could call it compatibilism free will, and the second one is called incompatibilism free will. So we're going to first look at compatibilism. Again, this was used by Christians like Augustine. Um, again, John Calvin would use this kind of argument, and then even some of the reformers that followed him, Francis Turretin, believed this. Many of the Puritans would argue along these lines, but what they would say is that genuinely moral free agents may err in their moral choices. So if people are morally free, then they make mistakes in their moral choices. They err, and therefore humans may use their power to turn against God. And I think that is something that is true. Now, even though we may be slaves to sin, we still use any kind of will that we have, as non-Christians, to act against God and to turn against Him. So there are some people that believe that there is a free will that is always used to turn against God, and that's definitely what Augustine believed. And so Augustine would say, you never use your free will apart from the regenerative power of Christ. You never use that free will to turn towards God. You will always use that free will to rebel against God, and that's where he's getting at with his kind of compatibilistic answer here. So God, and where we come with this argument, is God will not violate the free agency, the free will of humans, even if they are going to sin. Now I italicize that will there because we're gonna use some stronger language in incompatibilism, but God will not violate the free agency of humans, even if they're going to sin. And I think we can believe that God will allow people to sin. He will allow them to choose sin over himself through their own free will. And so I don't see anything that is theologically or doctrinally wrong with this explanation. People like Augustine were trying to give an answer as to why evil exists in the world. And it's because there is a certain level of free will that man has, that has been given to him by God, where God does not violate that free will, but allows people to rebel against him and for evil to persist in the world. And so it's not a bad answer. It's definitely, I believe it's within the confines of biblical teaching. I'm not so sure about incompatibilism, but I do think this one, we can see it in the Bible. But when we look at it, I'm going to talk about incompatibilism first. I thought we were going to some of the problems with it. Let's talk about incompatibilism. This is also sometimes called libertarianism, not to be confused with the political ideology. When we talk about libertarian free will, we're talking about a will that cannot be violated by God. So this is used by Christians like C.S. Lewis, Alvin Plantinga, William Lane Craig. All right. These guys are not so much Augustinians when it comes to the free will and sovereignty of God. They're not Calvinists. They're more Arminian in their thinking, if you will. And so they believe that genuinely morally free agents may err in their moral choices. People who have free will may make wrong choices when they're making moral choices. That's the exact same point of compatibilism there. Therefore, humans may use their power to turn against God. Nothing wrong with that there either. We said the same thing over in compatibilism. However, the difference here is God cannot violate the free agency of humans, even if they are going to sin. So the difference here and how the free will defense is presented by incompatibilists is they will, at least this is how I would see it. This is not how everybody sees it. I would say that they limit God's sovereignty in some respects by saying that God cannot violate the free agency of humans, even if they are going to sin. I don't know if that is biblically true. I think there may be some cases where God intervenes and definitely helps to change the free agency of humans so that they don't sin. I, th- but this is what incompatibilists will say. They do not believe that if people or they do not believe that God's sovereignty, a high view of God's sovereignty and a high view of man's free will can be held in together. They believe they are always in contention, and so they really vie for the free will of man. They want to hold it up higher than really God's sovereignty, although they won't say that. They do not believe that God can violate the free will of man, and I'm not sure the scripture takes us that far. I am much more in line with the compatibilist view of Augustine. This is my personal preference. You do not have to go along with that. I definitely believe the scripture a gives us an understanding where we could say God will not violate the free agency of humans, even if they are going to sin against him. I am not in my own theology, I'm not willing to say that God cannot violate the free agency of humans, even if they will, even if they're going to sin against him. That's just something that I don't bring myself to. I'm not saying that you can't follow it. There are many Christians who do, and some of them are very good Christians. I mean, when you look at that list up there, Lewis and Flanagan and Craig, those are people who have done a lot for Christian apologetics. I just happen to disagree with their theology on this. So that's the big difference between incompatibilism and compatibilism. The determination of the will is completely incompatible with being influenced with forces outside the human will. Even God, not even God can influence the human will in any way in this kind of incompatibilism. God's sovereignty and human free will are completely incompatible. That's how you remember what that is. Now, that is the free will defense and the two ways that we offer it, but there are also, there's some benefits and problems to this type of defense. Some of the benefits are is that evil is rooted in human autonomy. And so I think we can give when we give this free will defense, whether it's from a compatibilist or an incompatibilist, viewpoint or perspective, we see that evil is rooted in human autonomy and not in the creation of God. So the rebellion and the sin comes from human autonomy, and it's not a byproduct or a product of God. So that's actually a benefit. This is something this defense does very well and demonstrate. It shows that God is not responsible for evil in any way. And that is something that we want to uphold because we believe in a all good God. We don't want to have a God who is in any way responsible for evil. However, there are some problems with it, and mainly the big problem is that this free will defense cannot answer for the root of what we call natural evil, as natural evil does not result necessarily from the free moral actions of humans. Now, what do I mean by that? Well, natural evil, if you want to, natural evil is the evil that just happens in the world. Natural evil is a tsunami, an earthquake, a tornado, a hurricane that kills people, that destroys cities. These are things that happen in the world. Now we could argue that all the way back to the fall, that maybe if the fall never had happened, we'd never have things like this. That sin that came into the world introduced disasters like this, and we can make that point. But the idea here is that natural evil does not find its root in a sin that I directly cause. Natural evil, we don't see tornadoes because I did something bad or because you did something sinful. No, that's not how it works. So this kind of free will defense, it has a problem answering where natural evil comes from. It's great in answering where human evil comes from. Why do people murder each other? Why do people cause injustice? Why do people steal? Why do all these terrible things happen? Well, it's because of our human autonomy. And so, and I could go on and on and on about individuality and autonomy and how those are pillars of our American culture and how they are maybe the root of all evil when we really get down to it. but that's a rabbit trail I don't want to get into now. So the free will defense does a great job at showing us that, but it cannot show us where natural evil comes from. We're kind of left with nothing when it comes to the problem of answering that. And so what we have to do is we have to find another defense that we can use in conjunction with this. I wouldn't say that this is an incomplete defense. I would say the free will defense is good for using on evil that is rooted in human autonomy, but not necessarily all evil out there. And so this is just another trick or tool that you can put in your bag to use when you're talking to non-believers. So another answer, I'm not sure why my slides keep doing this. I apologize. I thought I set them all to come up paragraph by paragraph. The greater good defense, the question I ask at the top is it possible that within God's infinite wisdom, he allows evil to happen because providentially all situations are moving towards God's desired ends? And so evil has a secondary status, not being a direct creation of God. It's something that God can actually use, even though it is happening, and even though He did not have any really intention or He did not create it, He had no part in it. He can still use it to bring about His desired ends. And we see that some moral goods are the result of evil actions. And I have Genesis 50:20 there. If you know your Bible well, you'll know that that is the story of Joseph and his brothers, where they are brought together again. And Joseph tells his brothers that when they threw him into the pit and they tried to get rid of him for good, that they meant it for evil, but God meant it for good. And so what we see in this kind of thing is that some virtues, some good things are the logical conclusion of evil actions. And we see this most directly when we talk about evil and the fall. So when we talk about the fall, or we talk about man falling away from God's perfection and we falling into sin, that has to happen if we are ever to experience the grace and mercy of God, which is God's redemption. Without the fall of man, we never experience the redemption of man. We just stay in this kind of created state where everything is good. But even you could take that out even more. We understand in creation that God made everything good, and even man is described as very good. But when we look at the doctrine of glorification and what it will be like when we are one day in paradise and we are in the presence of God for all eternity, we will be glorified and we will not remember sin. We will not experience sin anymore. And so there's almost an idea of perfection there, that that sin and evil had to happen so that we could experience redemption, and that so that we could experience glorification and this almost this state of perfection and being in the presence of God for all eternity. And evil has to happen for that to happen. And so there's this idea in the greater good defense that God has allowed evil to happen because in his providence, in his moving of everything towards his desired ends, he is using all those situations to bring about his purposes and his ends. And so the greater good defense, Douglas Groothuis, he says in our reading from this week, he says, God uses certain evils to actualize a good greater than would be possible otherwise. If it weren't for the fall, we would never experience the redemption that is offered through Jesus Christ. We would never experience that same level of grace, excuse me, that was offered through God in Christ. So the death and resurrection of Christ offers the ultimate example of this greater good. Without human rebellion, this is again from Groothuis, without human rebellion against God, God's own unparalleled work of reconciliation in Christ could never have occurred. And that's what we've been arguing for. Evil has happened for the greater good. All this evil that we see in the world, it's happening because God is active in bringing about his own desired ends, his own purposes. And that is one of the answers that we can offer. So we've got two answers there so far to use: the free will defense, God allows evil to exist so as not to violate a person's free will, but allows them to um, sin even if it's against him. But he's also using that sin to bring about a greater good that conforms to his purposes. And so, lastly, um, well, I know I called this, excuse me, the cross and the redemption or resurrection of Christ. So we're going to call this Frame's tri-perspectival defense. And this comes from John Frame's chapter. Actually, he has two chapters on the problem of evil in his apologetics book. This comes from his second chapter, where he actually gives his defense against the problem of evil. And he kind of encompasses everything we've talked about here. So, but one of the things that he does mention that really no one else talks about, or at least we didn't talk about in our reading from this week, is that he really wants to make the case that God is the standard for his own actions, and that God does not need to explain his own actions to us. And while this sounds callous, this may be a hard truth for us to, you know, use and to embrace. This is the biblical truth, and so we have to accept it at some level, and we have to learn how to use it and to employ it. God does not need to explain his actions to us. Think of Job in the or in the Old Testament. Job is a master's class in the problem of evil. Why is all these bad things? Why are all these bad things happening to a righteous man? And you get to the end of the book, and God never really gives an answer. He asked Job a lot of questions about, where were you when I did this? Where were you when I did this? God is stating there in some respects that he's not responsible to give a explanation of his actions to Job. He doesn't have to. He is God and Job is not. And so again, while that answer may sound callous, and we would definitely not want to say that to someone who is struggling with the emotional problem of evil, that is something that we can use in the philosophical problem, because if we believe in a theological God that is all good, that is all knowing, that is all powerful, well, he has different standards for his actions than we do. And he he does not report to us. He is not responsible to report his actions to us. We are responsible to him. And so it really puts us in the right relationship for God, understanding there's this vertical relationship where God is God and we are not. So that's Frame's first part of his tri-perspectival defense. The second part is really more or less the greater good defense, what we just talked about. Our present experience is meant for our future good. Using this evil that is happening now is meant for fulfilling God's purposes, his providential purposes and his ends that are for our good. They're for better than anything we could imagine for ourselves. And so that's his second part of the tri-perspectival defense. And the third part is that God's word gives new hearts. And this is just a good theological truth to bring into conversation. Scripture helps to understand evil in a new light. We should not understand evil as this devastating problem that results in just total, apathy, or, just brokenness all the time. Yes, we should mourn. Yes, we should feel hurt, and we should empathize and sympathize and all that stuff. But at the same time, if we are in the Word of God, and the Word of God is informing us, and it's shaping our hearts, it's going to allow us to see the evil that goes on in this world in a different light, and to know that God's purposes are higher than ours, and that he is working everything to his ends, and not just for our material comforts and our emotional comforts now. And so that's really Frame's tri-perspectival defense. That's what he says, how we should understand evil. It's a bit more of a biblical defense, but he is a presuppositionalist. He's a little bit different than Grotius's, background in his cumulative case apologetics. So, but I think those are three good defenses that we could use, and those ideas of helping us understand how God is all good, all knowing, all powerful, but also we have to put that together with evil exists in this world and we can't deny it. So we have to explain then why that is the case and why there is a good God who loves us, who wants to redeem us, who even uses evil for his own purposes for our greater good. And so those are the answers offered for tonight. That is the end of the class. I hope you enjoyed everything. I will see you next time where we were going to talk about the way that I use my own kind of method and doing apologetics, and that will be our last class. So thank you all very much, and I hope you have a good night, and I can't wait to see you next time.